Hello, my name is Sarah Elis-Nilsson, and today I will be presenting on using manuscript fragments to map lived religion, the case of the cults of saints in medieval Sweden and Finland. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to present at this rich and diverse conference on different aspects of archives and archival material. In this presentation, I will provide a short introduction to the recently launched Digital Humanities project, Mapping Lived Religion, Medieval Cults of Saints in Sweden and Finland. Mapping the cults of saints and using digital methods to contribute to our understanding of lived religion in medieval Sweden and Finland is the primary goal of this interdisciplinary research, which combines the disciplines of history, art history, and archaeology. Among the source material used in the project is the earliest evidence for the veneration of saints in Sweden and Finland, fragments of liturgical books. I will also introduce the Swedish fragment material and its history, as well as discuss how calendar fragments in particular are in the process of being made accessible in new ways via this forthcoming research portal. First, and the overarching project description, the who, when, and what. The project members are currently building a comprehensive online database with an interactive map that will provide users with access to data from cultural heritage collections, mainly museums, libraries, and archives, and previous research results through the principles of linked and, where possible, open data. The resource is creating a comprehensive register of cult and holy places, medieval religious buildings. The medieval texts and objects in the database form the foundation of the future open access online digital resource for research and education, and which will allow the analysis of Swedish and Finnish data together. In the project's first phase, the art history material, images, inventories, and metadata has been the primary focus of both digitizing and database development and input. Work has now also commenced on the next phase, importing the medieval letters, diploma, and calendar fragments. The project members are comprised of the researchers, myself, Therese Zachrisson, Anders Fremark, and Lena Lepe, as well as our research engineer, Johan Olfeldt. We're financed by the Swedish Research Council for the digitization and accessibility of cultural heritage collections and based at Linnaeus University. The digital infrastructural development for data analysis is provided by the Center for Digital Humanities at the University of Gothenburg, who are involved with ensuring long-term sustainability, especially as the portal is intended to be used as a future resource and not just for the duration of the project. Formal collaboration with two cultural heritage institutions, the Swedish Heritage Board and the Swedish National History Museums, is also part of this project. The project time period is from 1164 until 1593 and the Uppsala meeting, which is considered to be the point at which the Swedish Reformation was well underway and there would be no return to the Latin or later Catholic Church. The project also makes inroads into the 17th and early 18th centuries due to the nature of the source material and the later church inventories. The geographical scope is the medieval Swedish ecclesiastical province, that is, the medieval borders which include Finland, but do not include several current Swedish provinces, Bohuslän, Halland, Blekinge, and Skåne. The dioceses, parishes, churches, monasteries, and holy or cult places throughout this landscape are in focus. This is a research-driven digitalization project, and the overarching research questions are, as mentioned, centered around medieval lived religion and the study of its expression in both textual and material sources for the veneration of saints. Now, shortly about the digital resource and methods, our four main methods include linked data, digitization, spatiality, and transcription. Linked data, this database is based on linked open data principles with structured data consistency and with stable identifiers and so on. Digital representations of objects are linked to places, individuals, and dates. As for digitization, we are making a database of medieval places, texts, and objects. And then there is also the formal collaboration with the Swedish National History Museums and the Swedish National Heritage Board to digitize parts of their collections. The Swedish History Museums will provide high-resolution images of Medeltidens bildvärld, the medieval picture world, and the Swedish National Heritage Board is digitizing the iconographical register, all of the cards and information on medieval artwork that have been collected over a number of decades. There we're using OCR and photos. The collections will also be made available through Swedish Open Cultural Heritage, SOCH or Kurshamsök in Swedish, which applies LOD principles and is not, of course, just for the project. So the digitization will also is also for the cultural heritage institutions. In addition to this formal collaboration, we have personal and informal collaboration with National Archives of Sweden and Finland to digitize or make images and data available through our portal with regards to the fragments and diplomas and letters. Earlier digitization projects and existing infrastructure have also been utilized, for example, in the creation of the list of medieval cult places and buildings. Fornsök, which is from the Swedish National Heritage Board, and the Register of Buildings have been used in that work. Some of these data are linkable or available via Swedish online cultural heritage as well. The plan is also to link to and build on existing infrastructure and these other digitization projects in different ways in Sweden and Finland. Other projects, earlier projects at the Swedish National Archives, or also when we, in the third phase, when we get to the Finnish material, the fragments at the Finnish National Library. Images will be accessible via a IIIF International Image Interoperability Framework format. As for spatialization, we have a mapping component which provides a visual overview of the places in our project. It will allow for analysis, the distribution patterns of saints, objects, and patronage in time and space, for example. As for transcription, currently all transcriptions are input directly into the database, as I will discuss in relation to registering the fragment material. The implementation of XML codes is currently under development as well. However, we are planning to implement direct text transcription for some of the manuscript images, in particular the calendar fragments. At the moment, collecting these and discussing solutions with the Swedish National Archives in terms of linking the fragment database and including new images. The existing ones are in IIIF, as I will come back to. As mentioned, the concept of lived religion as expressed through the cults of saints is the overarching research question. We use the term lived religion to emphasize ordinary, everyday religious practices and experiences related as discussed and explored in the context of pre-modern lives, for example by Elizabeth Hackedal, Meredith McGuire, and Robert Orsi. In our take on the concept, these practices can include those based on institutional dogma and theology, but any official or formal aspects are examined to determine ways in which they shape and interact with the ordinary, that is, lay people's varied experiences. Thus, religion is a set of actions, more fluid and not a fixed system of belief. In terms of the spatial analysis component, we are looking to investigate, for example, pilgrimage patterns, local devotion to particular saints, seen through the creation of images and dedications of altars, for example, the spread of relics, as well as the introduction and retraction of feast days. All of these will be seen as ways to get to a better understanding of lived religion in the medieval period in Sweden. Just to give everybody an idea of the area that we're considering here in the project, it's the medieval boundaries. As you can see, these lines here represent, and then where I'm pointing at the point of the medieval boundaries of the Swedish ecclesiastical province. And here we have a Gamla Uppsala, which is Old Uppsala, and we have also right beside it Öster-Aros, which is today's Uppsala, which became the archdiocese of the Swedish ecclesiastical province. And here we have Lund, which is the archdiocese of the Danish, and Nidaros is of the Norwegian. So, and Iceland, Greenland, Orkney, and so on are not shown here on the map. But as you can see, the modern boundaries of Sweden encompass a larger area, at least to the south, than is included in the project. But of course, we also have the Finnish area, which needs to be considered, as it was indeed a part of medieval Sweden. In the following, I will give a short introduction to the fragment material in Sweden, held mostly by the Swedish National Archives in Stockholm, with an emphasis on the liturgical material, especially the calendars, to provide some context as to the extent that to which they have been catalogued and digitized. And I will also mention, of course, the material in Finland. The image that we see here on the slide is of fragment 27557 from a 15th century missal. This is a calendar fragment for January, and the missal was in use, and the calendar, of course, was in use in the Linköping diocese. For the early medieval period in Sweden, and of course Sweden including Finland, from about the 12th to the 14th centuries, the Swedish liturgical material is fragmentary. However, a number of complete liturgical books, many printed, still survive from several medieval dioceses. These, of course, usually include calendars, and this way of organizing the year into saints, including saints' feasts, was valid up until the Reformation, when the saints' feasts were redacted, and also during the time of when the mutilation of these particular books, now then considered obsolete, took place. It will thus be important to consider both the calendar fragments and the later manuscripts and printed books in order to further examine the development of saints' feasts over time. But the fragments, of course, occupy a particularly important spot. The parchment fragments represent over 6,000 manuscripts used in medieval Sweden, and it is lucky that these mutilated codices survived at all. As one of the consequences of the Reformation and the ecclesiastical reforms in the Nordic countries, folios from the now obsolete and discarded liturgical manuscripts were reused, among other things, as parchment covers on account books or as thin strips to reinforce new book bindings. Of course, reusing or repurposing the valuable and costly parchment from worn-out books was not unheard of in the medieval period. Thus, this was not a new practice initiated in the Protestant Reformation to destroy these books when these particular books were recycled. Instead, it shows a continuity of practice in terms of book history. In Sweden, the king, Gustav Vasa, decided to repurpose the pages of mutilated liturgical books as covers for the kingdom's accounts. His successors continued the practice. Indeed, the accounts of the chamber archives from the mid-16th to the early 17th century are nearly all bound in pages from old volumes, including liturgical, theological, medical, and hagiographical works, as well as Bibles, many Bibles, confiscated from the church. This systematic use resulted in the eventual preservation of these mutilated books in the Swedish National Archives, and eventually in Helsinki in the Senate Archives, and then moved to the National Library of Finland, as Finland was once a part of the Swedish kingdom. By 1930 in Sweden, the historian archivist Tony Schmid began the systematic cataloging and collation of the fragment material as part of a project slated to take 3 years, but which in reality lasted well over 40, and we could, well over 40 years. Schmid's main interest was in the liturgical books. These have been most thoroughly examined. The project was revived in the 1990s under the name Medeltida pergamentomslag, that is, medieval parchment covers, with the objective to digitize Schmid's card catalog, the Catalogus Codicum Multiorum, or CCM, the catalog of mutilated manuscripts, by inputting the catalog into a database. In addition, further fragments were examined and cataloged. The database, which includes some photographs, is now available online as the Database of Medieval Parchment Fragments. However, as with all databases, MPO contains information of interest to and collected by those who created it. There are lacunae even regarding the list of feast days on the calendar fragments, one of Schmid's particular interests. However, it is a vital resource for initial research into this material. Many photos of the material required by a project do not yet exist. Those that do are available in IIIF format and can be linked to, for example, use in transcription software. So it is definitely a great resource. The finished material testifies to the existence of at least a further 1,500 manuscripts used in medieval Sweden. In Finland, starting in the mid-19th century, the account books and tax records with parchment fragments were removed. The collection of fragments was then transferred to the Helsinki University Library, which is now the National Library. The first attempt to systematically catalogue the liturgical material was started in the early 20th century. However, it was not until the 1970s that work was started on a systematic catalogue of all of the fragment material. In the early 21st century, the previously uncatalogued fragments were catalogued, providing a foundation for a digital database, the first one to be made available in the Nordic countries. The finished fragments are now available online in the Fragmenta Membrana database. They have all been photographed, and it is also a brilliant resource, just as the other one. Turning now to calendar fragment saints and lived religion, as in our project. So what are the calendar's potential for research in terms of lived religion? In this project, I'm analysing the development of saints' feast in the Church province, their observance, the addition and removal of feasts in the calendar fragments, the liturgical rank, including the addition and number of lessons. The aim is to use digital methods to compare the feast days in time and space and map the calendars to their diocese. The location of use is often not identifiable to more specific a location than just a diocese or from the entire Church province. For the Swedish material, the manuscripts were collected systematically, and their leaves were usually repurposed for accounts from the district in which the medieval parish or ecclesiastical institution was located. Thus, determining which diocese a calendar was in use is frequently possible based on where the account book comes from. And in some very few cases, the parish or religious house can be identified. Of course, other indicators than just the account book can be used, such as the feasts later found in the printed calendars and saints only venerated by certain religious orders. The final version of the liturgical year will also be inputted into our resource and can be used as a comparison. Of especial interest is the observance of the feast and whether or not people other than the clergy were expected to observe a particular feast day. In the calendars in question, these feasts are often marked in red, or sometimes, in the later calendars, indicated by the term Festum terrae or fori, i.e. feast for everyone. In the interest of a complete picture, the Festum chori, that is, feast for the clergy, are also inputted. This inclusion will allow for the analysis of the regression and progression of special, general observance, feast days. The impact of these prescribed feasts on the general public is the focus of this part of the research. The feast days will be compared to other evidence, including in the database, as cult manifestations for the development of the veneration of particular saints. It is hoped that this multifaceted picture will provide insight into lived religion related to the celebration of saints' feast days. In the following, I will be presenting two practical examples as an overview of how the calendars are inputted into the database and the way the information is organized and categorized, as well as fits in with the rest of the data. Just a reminder, this is a new digital resource that is currently under development and not a finished product. So it's not all polished and shiny, and we do welcome feedback. So I've mentioned this term several times, cult manifestation, and that is, we use it as evidence, or we use that term to refer to evidence for the veneration of a saint. When we input something into the database, we start with place. Everything is linked to a point on the map and to our register of medieval churches and holy places. And then we identify the overarching type of evidence. These come in only a limited number of categories. Feast day, of course, as in this case, that in the two examples that I will be providing soon. Feast day, narratives, cult objects, patronage, and then also prayers and devotional acts. So 5 overarching types of evidence. And then we have what we call right now a type of evidence subcategory. And among these then is Festum terrae and Festum chori, so the observance of feast days. But it can also be an altarpiece, it can be a wall painting, so from the art historical material, and also miracle stories and so on. And all these tables are linked together. The calendar transcriptions that we're working on right now will be tagged with the saint's name, with color, red being Festum terrae, the observance of a feast, the number of liturgical lessons, addition of a feast plus date, the strike through of a feast plus a date, the name, and the actual feast day. Of course, it's usually more difficult with referral to editions and strike-throughs. Considering the paleographical dating, it's easier to date the later editions rather than rubbing or striking through with these removals. But they will be also included in any case. The first example is fragment 25594, a calendar on 2 folios, including March, April, September, and October, as you can see in the image. The image is of October, and that is the example that will be going through in the next 2 slides of how the actual information on about this calendar is organized in our database. From MPO, the medieval parchment covers database, finding fragments can be done in many ways. In this case, you can search for calendars and it comes up, but sometimes calendars are also registered as in missals or as breviaries as part of those collections. Of those collations. This particular fragment has been dated to the 13th century, and the place of production and provenance, original provenance, is England. And this has been determined via both which saints have been included, but also the paleographical dating and provenance. The secondary provenance is from the Skara diocese in Sweden, and this is due to certain feast days that have been added into the calendar. Among these, Spinea Corona, the feast of the crown of thorns, which is on a particular date in Skara, a different date. The calendar is possibly from a breviary, but this is uncertain, as these are the only folios that have been identified and re-put together. And also the secondary province can be determined in which collection is. This Samlingen S, the Swedish National Archive collection there at the top, is something that you get when you that comes up in the database. This particular one, this is my own picture. It doesn't have a picture in the archives database. And then you make you can't order a fragment based on the fragment number. It has to be done based on the account book collection, where the account books are either the parchment fragments, as in this case, that have been taken off the account books, are organized in different collections, or you have to order it by the account book, because some of them are actually still attached to the early modern accounts. So continuing with example 1, this is how we input the feast days on the calendar that you saw in the previous slide. And if you notice, there were different colors of ink there for each of the feasts. And then the red is been interpreted as the Festum terrae, the feast for everybody. So here, of course, we have the place ID as Skara diocese, because we are actually not sure where exactly in the diocese that this particular calendar was in use. It could have been in use in the cathedral or in one of the other churches, the parish churches. And here it's been inputted as the type of evidence is a feast day, and then the subcategory is a Festum terrae. And in this case, we can also include uncertainty. This is an uncertain interpretation of the red ink in this case. In some cases it's much more clear, it's been added, it states specifically Festum terrae, but in this case, are these feasts that were in the calendar you saw, are they actually this or not? So we have an uncertainty marker here. And the feast days is 10 for October, so it's the feast is not specific day, but as in which month of feast days are we listing here, and I'll get back to the next slide of which actual saints are there. This is a big form that we fill in the portal where we're working on building the database. The production date is of the actual, so the 13th century, and we give these in intervals. So that's for that. And then the function time period is when was this calendar in use? And this is really important because in some cases we have calendars, of course, that maybe we can see that it was not used after a certain period, if we can identify that in any way, and then we can give a terminus to that. But this function time period is open, so it would have been in use from about 1200 and then until the end of the Middle Ages, but it's not actually clear when the calendar was stopped being used, if it was before the end of our period. So the 16th century is the default there at the end. The comments about the dating here, all of these feasts were written in the original hand that I have included in the Festum, so that comes from the original calendar as it was produced in England. And then we have comments about the feast day, and here I write about the use of the red ink, which indicates the Festum terrae, and the liturgy for these are all unknown or 9 lessons, and that is given as a connection to the actual feast day of the saint itself, rather than the general feast for Skara. And then, as I mentioned in a moment ago, the placement in Skara is really due to the placement of spinare corona in the 14th century on September 2nd. And of course, as said, the manuscript was made in England. And then we can see when it was last updated, and you can see that I inputted this at the beginning of July this year, and of course who it was created by myself. And if anybody modifies it, we get the name of that person as well, so we can keep track and actually identify who is inputting what information into the database. So this is the input form at the bottom. So if you can imagine the slide before this one and this one are actually attached together. And here we connect then the saints in this particular manifestation. So here we see that Luke the Evangelist, Michael the Archangel, relics, all saints, they have Simon, Zelotes, and Jude Thaddeus are all written in red in this particular calendar. So there was presumably some sort of observance, a general observance for these feast days in the Skara diocese. Now, of course, this is presumptive of whether or not Skara kept the observance as it was written up in the production of this particular calendar in England. Under quotes, we see here down under this bit that this is the verso side of the page, and there is the transcription that I've made of each of the feast days. Here we're working, as I said, on the XML still, and even the HTML editor isn't working. So the font color comes up here as the code rather than actually being the color in this particular case after you've saved. So we're still working on that. But in this case, it's only colors and there's no strike through or anything such. And here we have the entry in, so we can directly link to the entry in the database at the Swedish National Archives. The second example in my talk today is of fragment 25618, which is also a calendar, obviously, for July and August. And that's the only part of the calendar that we have left. This particular calendar is been dated to the 14th century, and the provenance is Uppsala, so Uppsala province. So it was in use somewhere in the Swedish ecclesiastical province. The calendar is probably from a personal breviary. We do not know whose, and this conclusion has been made due to the size. It's quite a small fragment. It wouldn't have come from a larger church book. And in this case, it's been cut in a circle and made into some sort of pocket with another piece of parchment and sewn together. So it was used found among the account books, but it's not used as a cover or as a binding reinforcement. In this case, it's also considered to be a detached, however, a fragment. So it is placed in a volume. This is Collection S, or Samlingen S in Swedish. And this is how, when we go into the medieval parchment cover database, to find this, we need to to get that archive number to retrieve it, and not the fragment number. So the same thing here. So in the next 2 slides, I will also be showing how this particular fragment has been put in, and the example here is instead the Festum chori. In this case, I'd just like to point out the map, which there was also a map of Skara there, and all of these white points here that we have on the map are points where we have cult manifestations. At present, most of them are related to the art historical material. And in Uppsala, there's a point now for the diocese, but we will be modifying that to be able to visualize it in a different way. But right now, the diocese is also represented by a point in Uppsala. So for that fragment that was on the previous slide, this is how it was input into the database as Festum chori for the month of July. The cult manifestation, of course, also has a number, so it's easy to search, a unique identifier in the database. So here we see that the place is the Uppsala Archdiocese. So it's the whole province is the way we indicate that right now. There is an uncertainty as to place. We don't know where it was in use or who owned the book. The type of evidence here again is the feast day, and then the subcategory, as I mentioned, was a Festum chori. And once again, I put the subcategory uncertainty here because we're not actually sure if these saints' days, how they were celebrated. We need other evidence to back up that the clergy actually celebrated these saints liturgically, but it's highly likely. And then the feast day, or rather the month, is July. This particular calendar was produced in the 14th century, as mentioned. So then there's the production date, the interval for the production date, and the function time period is from about 1300, of course, and until the end of our study period. And in this case, it is a calendar produced somewhere in the Uppsala diocese, or rather in the Uppsala province. So that is the original. It's a local production in the archdiocese or in one of the other dioceses. The dating is based on, here I wrote this based on the medieval parchment fragment database. And again, the conclusion that it was probably from a personal breviary and when it was last updated. And in this case, it's when it was input and by myself again, and it hasn't been modified. So going to the next slide, just remember this is a long form that we fill in, and this is the bottom part of it. So in this part, we see that the saints listed on that particular fragment that we just saw are all apostles: Januarius, Mary Magdalene, Apollonius of Ravenna, Felix the martyr, Abdan and Sennen, and Praxedius of Rome, and Pantaleon. Down here we have the quote, which is of course the transcription of the fragment, and in this case it's also just the font color. And if you note, this is the font color here. The quote is for both the Festum chori and the Festum terrae. So the Festum chori, we don't write that, it's black ink. And then the digital objects for the cult, we have the link to the medieval parchment fragment database and the fragment with the fragment ID there. So we link to that. To conclude, in this paper, I have presented an overview of an ongoing project to digitize and create a database of texts and material evidence for the medieval cults of saints in Sweden. In particular, the parchment fragments, their history and their place in the project have been highlighted. The calendar fragments are of particular interest as they provide evidence of the addition and removal of saints' feast days before the 15th and 16th centuries. By inputting data related to these fragments, it will be hypothetically possible, for example, to trace observance. By comparing various types of evidence for saints' cults in a particular area and at certain time periods, a clearer picture of the place of the saints in the everyday lives of Christians living in medieval Sweden will be possible. As a next step, in terms of digital methods and tools, we are currently discussing solutions on how to implement transcription direct from pictures using IIIF and a transcription program. This will simplify the tagging and input of transcriptions, as well as eliminate a step currently in place. In terms of future use of the resource outside of the project, other researchers will be welcome to input the data they need to use, and other liturgical fragments can be added. This is our application of academic crowdsourcing in the project. With regards to the liturgical material, we have discussed how to include musical notation in the database as well. Further development will be possible, bringing to light new facets in our study of medieval archival material. Thank you very much for your attention.